I'm really pleased to host and moderate today's webinar, The Prospect of the Serious Accident Punishment Act, especially after the new ROK government. Before we begin, I just want to thank Chosun Ilbo and Mr. Ken Choi, the Director General and Editor at the Chosun Daily newspaper. Mr. Choi is certainly an iconic leader within the media circles, and we all rely on his expertise greatly. Amcham represents over 800 member companies and affiliates in Korea, and they're all major stakeholders in the Korean economy. We really appreciate our partnership with the Asian Leadership Conference, which I believe has become one of the most influential platforms for the world's thought leaders to discuss global issues relevant to the business community. Today, we are discussing a very important topic that affects many companies located in Korea, both local and foreign. The Serious Accident Punishment Act, where we refer to as SAPA, is a new legislation that has been enacted on January 27th of this year. It holds executives responsible for industrial accidents that occur in their workforce. Simply put, the CEOs of these companies are now at personal risk, criminally, for these accidents. And I think we have seen a lot of prominent cases just in the past, several weeks. AmCham hosted special meetings with the four major presidential candidates before this year's actual election. And we discussed specifically this legislation. With a new government under President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol scheduled for May 10, I think today's discussion will be very timely in helping all of us understand this recent legislation, especially on how to mitigate any potential risks stemming from this regulation and how this regulation will likely evolve under the new Yoon administration. For today's webinar, we have a panel of two outstanding speakers. First is Sean McLaughlin. He is Vice President at Cadmus, a strategic and technical consulting firm based in Waltham, Massachusetts. At Cadmus, Sean leads the firm's safety, security, and resilience practice. Interestingly, he is also responsible for developing the National Preparedness Report, which is an analytical report delivered to the President of the United States annually. Sean is a graduate of Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. So obviously, and I hope he will know exactly the kind of insights that we're all looking for. Dave Park is a foreign attorney in the International Practice Group at Yun & Yang. He focuses on general corporate law, employment, and labor law. David works with a lot of Fortune 500 companies, and he is a graduate of the University of Auckland. So now let's get straight into our panel. And just for background, I just want to say that, again, the Korean government implemented SAPA on January 27, 2022. And it's a way to deter any unnecessary industrial accidents from occurring in the workplace. In fact, Korea has ranked at the bottom in terms of industrial safety among the 21 OECD member countries. And I think this is the reason why this law has taken front and center. So despite the government's good intentions, the business community in Korea has raised many concerns regarding SAPA. So let's get started. So both Sean and Dave, I'd like you to quickly share your thoughts on SAPA. And why do you think Korea had such a high rate of accidents compared to other OECD countries? So Dave, maybe I can start with you.
Yeah. Thanks for the introduction, James. So my personal take on it is that Korea's economy has rapidly grown in the past 70 years since the Korean War. Now, even though the economy has grown rapidly, it's Korea's workplace health and safety culture has been unable to keep up with its rapid economic growth, as the focus of companies and business have mainly been geared towards generating profits and revenue. And also, I think another important point is that individual workers really need to take more personal responsibility to ensure that they're complying with health and safety measures. So even though the company has like a very robust and comprehensive health and safety system, if the individual employees or workers don't really adhere to the regulations and the rules, then I guess the applicability and the influence of it won't be as heavy as supposed to be.
But I guess just as a follow-up, Dave and Sean, you could also chime in. Why Korea, though? Is it something about the Korean culture, the Korean people? Why are we having these major industrial accidents more so than other countries? So, David, maybe you could help me understand better your perspective. And Sean, you live in America. You know a lot of companies in the U.S. Or the culture in the U.S. David, I'd like you to follow.
Yeah. Okay, follow through. Yeah, so those are my two main reasons. I think it's just it's the workplace culture and the focus on profits due to Korea's rapid growing economy, and regardless of a developing economy, I think these health and safety aspects have not developed to keep up pace with Korea's growing economy.
And I guess I hear you say, there were profits and the fast growth in Korea has led to an acceleration of these greater numbers of industry accidents. Now, Sean, let me go to you. What's your perspective on it?
Sure. I think I largely agree with what some of the points that David was making there. I think for in general, for a topic that is kind of as big and complicated and involves a variety of different factors, I don't think there's probably one single cause or underlying cause, as to sort of why Korea is a bit of an outlier here in terms of workplace accidents and things like that. Certainly based on the literature that I reviewed, and kind of looking and thinking about the Korean experience versus the United States, I do think a lot of the points regarding the rapid industrialization in Korea is certainly seems to be a major driver. Sort of this historical, what I understand is a historical reliance on subcontractors in some industries and things like that, and sort of the broader I think some of the broader issues around focusing on near-term profits and things like that, I think are all things that are frequently pointed out in the literature about why among peer countries, Korea has a different sort of safety record than other countries. The thing that I would point out is that, if you were to go back, just 40 or 50 years, the United States, in terms of some of the key metrics around workplace safety and health, I think would be pretty similar to where Korea is right now. And so I think it is notable that, countries are able to make significant improvements to workplace safety and health, with focused efforts. It doesn't happen overnight, certainly. But, thinking about the U.S. experience, we have, in terms of workplace fatalities over the past kind of 50 years, have cut the incidence of workplace fatalities in half, and even done more on workplace injuries and illnesses. I think cutting them by more than 75% and things like that. So it kind of gives you a sense of, with sustained focus and effort and a combination of legal and regulatory reform and things like that, I think companies can, or rather, countries can make pretty significant gains in these important areas.
And as both of you know, I ran the GM business here in Korea. And I can tell you that at GM, workplace safety was really top of mind for every executive, from the CEO globally down to the working level, because companies like GM has taken it very, very seriously. Another thought on this has to do with the Korean culture of Alibali, or hurry. Does that have an impact to these issues that we're talking about today?
Yeah, so just to give you my personal take on it, I was raised overseas. I was actually raised in New Zealand. So just to give you my personal experience. So in New Zealand, everything is just so much slower. It takes a park gate in front of my house Like it took nearly a year to build it. I don't know if that's a good time frame, but I think other countries spend a lot of time on safety and health to make sure like properties or installments are well built. But in Korea, I'm just around me. I'm based in Gangnam, and I see like I come back next week and there's like a new building being installed, and so it's just really amazing. Like, because I was raised overseas my whole life, so I think definitely that Bali mentality also connects with the Korean businesses' main objective to cut costs and also I guess gain more profits. So yeah, I definitely agree with you with the Bali concept.
Well, I think that both of you talked about the need for short-term profits. David, you just mentioned, Korean companies wanting to cut costs, and obviously this culture of Alibali or speed. Well, maybe those are three interesting components, but I'm sure a lot of the CEOs here in Korea would differ otherwise as well, because I'm sure they feel they have a good system in place. And it's just unfortunate that we have some industry accidents. So I don't want to brand Korea as a country that's only focused on short-term results or
Yeah.
the Bali culture, but it's interesting that both of you have similar perspectives. So let me move on to the next question. Obviously, SAPA just became a new law in January. So how does SAPA compare to previous safety and health legislations that were already in existence? And why do you think SAPA is so different uh, versus the previous legislations? And Sean, why don't we go with you? Or David, actually.
Yeah. Thanks, James. So the Korean government has repeatedly indicated that the existing Occupational Safety and Health Act, which has been the key health and safety legislation in Korea, has not properly provided the expected measures such as prevention of accidents, follow-up management after an accident, and damage restoration from life-threatening accidents occurring in businesses or workplaces. And these kind of deficiencies have been responsible for the reoccurrence of large-scale accidents, sacrificing human lives. Now, with the enactment of the SAPA, companies and their senior management personnel are subject to higher punishment than as previously set forth under OSHA if a serious accident occurs. In particular, the SAPA intends to address legal loopholes of the existing OSHA, which actually allow business executives of the original principal contractor to shift their liability on workplace accidents by engaging third parties, meaning such as subcontractors, service providers, or others who have been delegated the work. Now, the new legislation expands the scope of punishment so that criminal liability may be directly imposed on the responsible executives of the original contractor. And in addition, the degree of punishment for negligent offenders, which has been relatively light so far, has become much more severe under the SAPA.
So David, as a follow-up, so in terms of implementation, what kinds of
Yeah.
accidents are going to actually incur criminal liability for the leaders of these companies?
Yeah.
Any gray areas that we should be aware of?
Okay, so the legislation divides serious accidents into two categories. So the first is a serious industrial or workplace accident. Now, this type of accident refers to any death, injury, or illness as defined under the Act, which are caused by work-related structures, equipment, raw materials, gas, steam, dust, or caused in the course of performing these works. Meanwhile, serious public accidents refers to serious accidents caused by a defect in design, manufacture, installation, or management of certain raw materials or products, public facilities, or public transportation, for example, public subway. And the Act has imposed a lot of onus on the responsible executive, which I've been mentioning early on. And a responsible executive under the Act is someone who represents the business and has the authority and responsibility to overall manage the business, or someone corresponding to the foregoing in charge of tasks related to occupational safety and health. Therefore, if a serious accident were to occur in violation of these duties, such as the case of a death or one or more people, a case where several people are actually injured or become ill and require treatment over a certain period of time, the responsible executive may be subject to harsh criminal liability and be accountable for punitive damages. So when OSHA was only around, most of the penalties were actually imposed on a mid-level manager level, so like the senior manager of a factory or plant. But SAPA has actually broadened the scope so that top management and CEOs now hold civil and criminal liabilities for workplace accidents.
I took a look at a recent survey of SMEs, and
Yeah.
what the findings show is that 50% of SMEs in the manufacturing industry raised a lot of concerns. And obviously, because they're smaller companies, the owner of these SMEs are probably personally, at risk. So, why is that, David?
Yeah, so the general consensus of smaller companies are that bigger companies are better off and well equipped to actually respond to this new legislation. But and smaller companies are actually arguing that the lack of in-house expertise to fully comply with the new legislation. Um, I saw a statistic that 80% of deaths from workplace or industrial accidents generally take place in workplaces employing less than 50 people. And SMEs have also expressed major frustration over a lack of workforce and capital to strengthen their safety measures under SAPA. Now, and they also argue it's impossible to establish a safety and health management system while working with subcontractors, given that workers of subcontractor companies may work at several work or construction sites as day laborers. It's difficult to set up a separate health and safety manual to educate those who leave once their daily duty is completed. And due to the ambiguous definition of responsible executive, controversy has been occurring over the scope of criminal liability exposure under the Act. So the law, which is still quite unclear at this stage as to what obligations responsible executives must fulfill to avoid punishment, has been criticized from the time it was enacted for violating the principle of legality. And the government has stated that it will work to clarify the law by drawing up an enforcement decree, which has been released but has only added to more confusion. And it's still quite unclear whether the target of punishment is the owner of a conglomerate, CEO of an affiliate or subsidiary, or a person in charge of health and safety in the company.
So, Sean, David obviously walked us through just the Korean perspective, and since you have more of a U.S. global, background, let's talk about other countries and how they treat a concept called SAPA, especially in the U.S. So, walk me through your perspective on it. Obviously, Korea has SAPA. In the U.S., we have other regulations as well, but what would America think about SAPA? And how do you perceive of SAPA?
Sure. I mean, I think from the United States perspective, SAPA is definitely pretty unique, in a couple regards. And again, I can't speak to kind of all industrialized countries. I won't profess to be an expert in sort of all of their health and safety regulations. But I think from the American perspective, there definitely are a couple unique things. First is at least as the act is written, the potential for broader, more widespread imposition of personal criminal liabilities on business owners and managerial staff. In the United States, bringing criminal charges against business owners or managers for workplace fatalities or workplace injuries does happen, but it's typically very rare, probably very, very rare. And, really, the cases where that does happen, it involves kind of what is described as willfully negligent behavior. So a business owner or a manager, specifically lying about, a workplace safety action that they were supposed to take, but didn't take, and kind of lying about it, or having been warned about kind of the potential for a serious industrial accident, saying that they were going to fix it, and then not in fact fixing it, or things like that. Those are the of kind of truly negligent cases where, at least in the United States, where business owners or managers would find themselves potentially facing personal criminal charges and things like that. And so I think SAPA is certainly unique in that it opens the aperture for the potential risk of Korean executives and managers and things like that. The second thing that I would point out that I think is different from the U.S. perspective is just kind of the scope and scale of the penalties. The mix of both certainly financial penalties at the personal level, of kind of criminal imprisonment potential at the personal level, as well, combined with financial penalties at the company level. Those are kind of at a different scope and scale than the type of penalties that I think U.S. firms would face for for typical types of violations. In the United States, even for kind of those kind of willfully negligent, the more serious types of violations, the basically the legislation says that the maximum fine is $250,000 per person, and up to $500,000. These are U.S. dollars for companies, and so the scope and scale of the penalties under SAPA are certainly greater than that. And there are certainly lots of critics in the United States who I think would say that perhaps the penalties in the United States are perhaps too low, and maybe not scaled appropriately given the size and scope and scale of, international companies and conglomerates and things like that. But I think, those are two big differences in terms of our sort of how the regime in terms of workplace safety and health here in the United States versus and kind of what this new SAPA law looks like in Korea.
And I think that one other difference that I see just from different conversations I have with our member companies is that in Korea the criminal penalty for CEOs is very, very high, but monetarily the fines are actually not that high. Whereas in the U.S., we're talking a lot of money when these cases either go to court or get engaged to some degree. So I think that's another difference. But Sean, we've had some major cases here in Korea recently, and without mentioning names, there's been a lot of fatalities with construction companies, manufacturing companies, and so on. So if the same thing happened in the U.S., what do you think would have happened?
Sure. I mean, like I was just mentioning, absent real kind of clear evidence of willful negligent behavior on behalf of a particular manager or a business owner, it's very likely that a company that had experienced workplace fatalities or things like that would be facing some sort of fine from OSHA here in the United States. There are also other avenues and other risks that that these firms might face outside of that kind of traditional workplace health and safety regulatory environment. It's possible that cases could be referred to state or local, district attorneys for criminal proceedings and things like that. Again, that doesn't happen a whole lot based on my experience and sort of review of the literature and things like that. I think probably what is the greatest financial liability that a company would face in that perspective in a situation like that would likely not come through the government side of things and sort of fines and things kind of coming through that side, but probably would come through the sort of basically civil lawsuits where if there were workplace fatalities, the family members of either the killed or injured workers very well, and it's pretty common, might seek damages in civil court. But again, that's pretty different than seeking actual criminal liability or criminal penalties. And that is where oftentimes, more so than in criminal proceedings, in some of those civil proceedings, James, I think you were mentioning, some of the potential for larger penalties that typically happens or can happen at least on the civil side in the United States.
And as I talk to the CEOs that are running U.S. companies based in Korea, it's a concern for a lot of these folks because in the large U.S. companies that are based in Korea, sometimes manufacturing doesn't report to the CEO here, right? So who is really, really responsible? And who does the Korean government go after to hold accountability? So those are all the interesting challenges that I think CEOs of American companies are kind of looking at themselves. And that's why I think we're having this great dialogue on addressing and preparing for it. So let's talk about the risk management strategy for SAPA. So David, again, this law just came into effect in January. So what are some of the specific safety measures that businesses should prepare themselves for in compliance with SAPA? And, maybe you can walk us through, pretty quickly some suggestions you have for business owners and real owners of these business management.
Okay, thanks, James. So as I've mentioned before in our discussion today, the enforcement degree of SAPA is actually still quite ambiguous, and it's not easy for companies and businesses to prepare clear measures currently. Nevertheless, it's important that companies to take proactive measures to comply with the SAPA based on the legislative intent of the Act, the contents of the enforcement degree, and relevant press releases and updates, guidances from the Ministry of Employment and Labour. So under the legislation, the safety and health obligations directly imposed on responsible executives under SAPA, I'm just going to go through them quite quickly. So the first is to establish and implement a health and safety management system by allocating manpower and finances budgets necessary to prevent accidents. Second is to secure a system to prevent reoccurrence of accidents and disasters and to implement relevant measures. Thirdly, measures to implement the improvement and correction orders of government agencies under relevant laws and regulations. And finally, having measures necessary to perform obligations under health and safety laws and regulations. So if you look at these requirements in a nutshell, it seems that the new Act focuses a lot on companies having a robust and proper compliant health and safety system, and also allocating manpower, relevant professionals, and also finances to have the system. So I think it's like this is my take on it. At the end of the day, it's impossible for serious accidents to not they will occur. It's business nature. I mean, we can't prevent accidents from not occurring at all. However, I think the new legislation has a two-pronged kind of purpose. So the first is to prevent companies to prevent serious workplace accidents occurring in these companies by these companies having a proper and compliant, safety and healthy culture and management system. And secondly is, if in the worst case scenario, a serious industrial accident were to occur, and when the authorities kick in the door, then the company will be able to show the authorities that, okay, unfortunately, an accident has occurred, but we have been compliant with the law. We've basically implemented all the correct health and safety measures. We've allocated manpower and finances. And I think that will be the key, the key aspect when the courts really decide to determine a civil or criminal penalty, is the concept of preparedness. How prepared was the company? How much money, how much manpower were they putting into health and safety on a regular basis prior to the accident? I think that's the key aspect right there.
Thanks, David. Hey, Sean,
Yeah.
you obviously have a very interesting experience. The very fact you send a special report to the President of the United States has some special meaning, obviously. So, what types of processes, tools, and systems do companies need to have? In fact, my real question has to do with, like, is there a checklist? Are there KPIs that you guys have in place that you recommend? Because if I'm running a company today as a CEO, how do I know that what I have is enough to accommodate for SAPA's requirements and to prevent these industrial accidents from happening?
Sure, I think there are several important types of processes and tools and systems that companies need to think about and need to be aware of when they're approaching compliance with SAPA. I think, as David noted, there still is a fair amount of ambiguity about, I think, how the law is going to actually be enforced and what it will mean in practice for firms. And so I think a lot of, what we have tried to, kind of focus on is kind of this, some of the tools and systems and processes focused around, broader preparedness, and certainly then occupational safety and health being a big part of that. And so, like, a couple things that I would point out on top of, I think, to build on what David was mentioning in terms of some of the specifics that SAPA requires of businesses to put in place. The first thing that I would call out is the importance of risk identification and assessment. And that's a I think a really important place for firms to kind of start, whether they're focused just on occupational safety and health, or whether they're thinking more broadly about kind of a broader range of business resilience and business preparedness. And I think it's important for firms to recognize that there are, they need to be thinking about risk identification and assessment at different levels, and kind of basically different types. And so what I mean by that is that, firms need to think about, okay, for particular workplaces or particular facilities, they need to be thinking about, okay, what are the specific risks and hazards that are relevant for that particular work site. They need to be, they might rely on an outside firm to do that. They might do that with their own internal team who's kind of working at that site to be able to kind of do a bottom-up review of risks and hazards. Also need to be thinking about, the historical data that they have in terms of workplace hazards. Are there particular facilities? Are there particular kind of types of activities where either workplace fatalities or workplace injuries are more common, and kind of feed that into how they're thinking about risk overall. Second thing that I would highlight here in terms of systems and processes and tools is the importance of plans and planning more generally. You heard David talk about, kind of this requirement for a health and safety system and plan, and so I think that's certainly important and is a requirement. But I think when we think about this, we think a little bit more broadly about not just a single plan, but about groups of plans or families of plans that are interrelated and can work together across different levels of the organization. So in addition to that, safety and health plan for the organization, need to think about what are facility level plans. If there are a bunch of facilities that are on a broader campus or industrial campus or things like that, some of those might need to roll up into a broader campus-wide sort of plan. And then again, that can roll up to a broader organizational level plan. And I think the other thing as regarding those plans is for them to focus both on the prevention side of things. So kind of thinking about, okay, what are some of the things, how can we plan and to try to prevent these types of accidents or incidents from happening. But they also need to include, response and recovery type of activities as well. Because as David noted, despite everyone's best efforts, it's unlikely that we're going to be able, or it's impossible that we're going to, firms are going to be able to prevent all types of accidents. And the third thing that I would just emphasize here is on the systems and processes and tool side of things is this idea of what we would call in the United States continuous improvement, and this means that it's not just enough to kind of check the box and to say, okay, we did our risk assessment, or it's not just enough to check the box and to say, okay, we developed some plans, based on our understanding of those risks, our workplace risks and hazards and things like that. There needs to be an ongoing process where firms are treating those as kind of living processes and living documents, where they're regularly reviewing them, looking to update them, making sure that their plans aren't just developed and then sit on a shelf and then are never used. And so then in terms of KPIs and things like that, I mean, obviously the ultimate KPI is on the outcome side, which is measuring reduced injuries and reduced fatalities and things like that. I think there are important other sort of like output and process measures that regarding these things around the number and scope and scale of plans that have been developed or revised, process measures around making sure that those assessments and plans and procedures are being reviewed and updated on a regular basis and things like that. And again, that I think speaks to, given some of the ambiguity about how the law will be enforced, I think are reasonable efforts that firms can take to try to mitigate their risks under SAPA. I would just note also that a lot of the things that we're talking about are probably a little bit easier for larger firms that have the resources to be able to do them. And I can certainly understand that perspective of smaller and more medium-sized companies that would face challenges, perhaps with some of the kind of need to do regular risk assessments and regular plan updates and things like that.
So obviously these companies, have internal assessments. Should these companies look at external, firms to help them with assessments, audits, and preparation? And if so, what kind of firms are the best for it? Is it a CPA firm? Is it a law firm? Are there special firms that specialize in these type of tools and processes? Sean?
Sure. So, yeah, I think I don't think it's the only way, but I think particularly for larger firms or for firms that have more complex exposure potentially, certainly bringing outside perspective in to help them think through what are their threats and hazards, and not just in the occupational safety and health and kind of world, but also potentially kind of thinking more broadly around business resilience and business preparedness and things like that. That I think in our experience has been a valuable. I think our clients that we've worked with in the United States and elsewhere would say that kind of having outside perspective can be very valuable. Just because outside firms come with fresh eyes, objective perspective, can sometimes help firms see exposure that they may have or risks that they may have that that frankly might not rise to the level of awareness if the firm is doing that themselves. And so certainly I think there's a wide range of companies that can kind of provide this type of support. I think the way that Cadmus has been approaching this, is that we're partnered, with David's law firm and kind of bringing both sides of expertise in terms of both the legal expertise, so that we can help firms navigate the legal side of things, and then Cadmus on our side as a kind of strategic and technical consulting company, can provide some of the more business consulting support around helping to take tools and processes that we've used for different companies, around the world, and kind of modifying them and adapting them to the unique circumstances of particular Korean firms and things like that.
That's great. Maybe one day, we can all partner together to make sure that companies operating here in Korea can really prepare themselves well for SAPA. But just as a follow-up, Sean, I know that today's topic is really about SAPA and industrial accidents, but I think that you use the word broad, right? So there are public health challenges associated with COVID-19, natural disasters, cybersecurity risks. So how do you think that companies should think about SAPA compliance with other areas that I just touched base on?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the things that we've really been focused on is in light of SAPA, obviously there is sort of this immediate requirement for firms to think about the occupational safety and health side of this, but also really trying to work with firms to think more broadly about preparedness and resilience writ large. And certainly occupational and worker safety and health is a part of preparedness, business preparedness and resilience, but it's not the only part. And as you noted, firms face a variety of threats and hazards, natural disasters, cyber attacks, public health. We're coming out of a 2-year global health pandemic. And so companies, I think, need to approach these challenges comprehensively and kind of look to address them comprehensively. And so, just focusing on occupational or worker safety and health isn't probably going to kind of get you all the way there. And so I think the processes and tools that I mentioned in the specific context of SAPA, risk identification, plans and planning, continuous improvement, those are the exact same types of tools and systems and processes that that we look to implement with firms who are looking to think more broadly about business preparedness and business resilience. And I think an important thing for firms to think about and to recognize is that, just limiting their focus to occupational or worker safety and health, kind of in the industrial accident perspective, is kind of pretty narrow and going to limit kind of their broader preparedness. If you think about a firm's kind of readiness for natural disasters, there are definite worker safety and health implications for how prepared a firm is for natural disasters, whether it be large storms or flooding or things like that. Similarly, thinking about cyber attacks, increasingly we're seeing that cyber attacks don't just happen kind of in the cyber world, but that they can have physical impacts that could have, again, impacts on workplace safety and health, could also potentially have like physical impacts on the general public. And then also, obviously what we've seen over the past 2 years in terms of the public health implications of COVID-19 and things like that. So whether it's on the risk assessment side or the plans and planning side, like definitely that assessment and those plans should include occupational and worker safety and health, but it shouldn't stop there. And I think the other thing that I would point out is that the experience that we have of working with firms in a variety of different contexts is that thinking about a broad range of hazards, thinking about workplace safety and health, thinking about natural disasters, thinking about cyber, thinking about public health and things like that. When you open that lens and that aperture, you start to see how some of these hazards and risks really are interrelated. And, we've had this experience of where, maybe a firm is just focused on one particular hazard or risk, or because they see that that's kind of their main thing, whether it be occupational safety and health or something else. And then, when we go in and kind of work with them and kind of open that aperture a little bit and say, okay, yes, we will focus on that, but there's a broader set of things we need to focus on as well. They start to see, again, how those risks and hazards are interrelated, how, the natural disaster risks, does have, worker safety and health impacts, or how cyber threats have worker safety health impacts and vice versa. So I think, our view on this is that, SAPA is a good forcing function to really focus on that workplace safety and health piece of things, but that firms shouldn't stop there, that it's really important, given the challenges that they're facing moving forward, kind of increasingly connected world, climate change, climate adaptation, increasing threat of natural disasters, that broader all hazards preparedness is a really important part of how companies should be thinking about business resilience and business preparedness.
Great. Thanks so much, Sean. So, David, let's talk about the future direction of SAPA. I mentioned before, at Amcham, we were very fortunate and honored to have hosted, at that time, presidential candidate Mr. Yoon Sung-yeol. This was in December, and he walked us through a lot of policy reforms. In fact, I did an hour and 20-minute one-on-one fireside chat with at that time presidential candidate Mr. Yoon, and I thought he was very deep, and he covered a lot of ground. And I believe we also talked about this legislation both before the meeting and during the fireside chat. So now that he will be the new official president of the Republic of Korea on the 10th of May, do you foresee any significant changes made to SAPA under his leadership?
Thanks, James. So at this stage, there isn't really much clear visibility on, whether, what kind of revisions it could be, or whether the enforcement degree could, or the legislation could be revised. I think there's been mention from the new administration coming in that the SAPA has to be more practical and more clear, because there's still some murky gray areas with regards to definitions and aspects and provisions within the legislation. I personally assume at this stage, I may be wrong, but since it's the early days of enforcement, the act has only been effective for 2 months at this stage, and I think there's been work-related deaths in the past 2 months. So that's quite a figure. It's lower than the same period last year, but it means that workplace accidents are still regularly occurring. So my personal take at this stage, there won't be major revisions, just because it's the early days. But there's potential that I guess the new administration would tweak the enforcement degree to clarify any gray areas, and also to make it more practical, because a lot of companies have been arguing and complaining that it's the act itself and the enforcement degree is quite confusing, and the provisions are really ambiguous. So in that area there may be some tweaks, but that's my personal assumption.
So you're kind of guessing there will be some tweaks. Can you give
Yeah.
us a clue to what kind of tweaks should be tweaked?
So I think the biggest issue, like question mark right now, is who is the responsible executive under SAPA? Because the responsible executive is the one who's actually being imposed with the serious civil and criminal penalties. And at this stage, there's still question mark and gray. It's still a gray area whether who satisfies the requirement to be responsible executive. So it could be the CEO, the representative director, the CSO. If there's two or multiple representative directors, what happens then? I don't think the government has actually provided specific guidance at this stage. So I think I'm not sure if it will specifically be a revision of the legislation, but there may be more guidance provided by the Ministry of Employment and Labour regarding the legislation. So it just really sort of provides more clarity regarding the provisions.
Okay. So, David, no, Sean, you obviously live in the U.S. You're not here in Korea, so maybe you can be a lot more open, with the audience and to us. So, in your view, is SAPA an effective policy approach to achieving the goals of reducing industrial accidents?
So,
Sorry to put you on the spot,
you know,
but we want to
yeah,
hear from you.
yeah. I mean, I think it really is. I think too early to tell, obviously, on how effective SAPA will be. I mean, I think it will be interesting to see over. As the law is implemented over a longer period of time, what sort of impacts it has, and sort of what takeaways other countries may take from basically from Korea's implementation of this law, because I mentioned earlier that the United States has seen pretty dramatic reductions in workplace fatalities and workplace injuries, but that reduction happened over the course of 40 or 50 years, and it's been kind of a relatively steady decline. And again, we don't in the United States don't have any sort of any sort of legal or enforcement regime that I think is kind of as strict as what SAPA is right now. So I think if the implementation and enforcement of the law, results in kind of really fast and positive gains in terms of reductions of workplace fatalities and things like that, I think you might see a lot of countries kind of take note of that and kind of think about, well, does this model, does this work? Conversely, if there aren't big gains, or if sort of things continue to kind of same general trajectory or stagnate or things like that, it'll be interesting to see sort of what are some of the tweaks and revisions that happen both within Korea and how other countries think about kind of adapting and learning from that experience. I mean, one thing that I think is very clear is that if compliance with SAPA is just seen as a box checking exercise, something that firms have to do to kind of do the bare minimum, make sure that they're covered and their risks are mitigated. I think that that's not likely to have the long-term positive outcomes that are intended under the law. I think a lot of it will really depend on obviously how it's implemented, kind of enforcement and some of the specifics, and whether there are tweaks and things like that. But I think just given the uniqueness of the law, I think it is. It will be kind of a bit of an early test bed to see if this type of legislation can work in other places potentially.
Yeah, and Sean, I know you have worked with or advised a lot of national, state, local, both private and public, organizations. And I think SAPA is more of a one size fits all approach. So do you think that SAPA might consider different practices for different industries, different sizes and whatnot?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think there definitely are, when we work with firms of kind of different sizes, different footprints, and things like that, and frankly, different industries. There are typically kind of very different needs that they have, and kind of different challenges that they have, both in the occupational safety and health world, but also in the broader business preparedness and resilience world, where we typically operate. And so I do think that there definitely are important differences across different sectors and different company sizes and things like that. I do think that those fundamental tools and processes and systems that I talked about at a high level, so kind of risk identification, plans and planning, continuous improvement, those are kind of high level first principles that I think are applicable across the board. But how those are adapted to particular sectors, how it is those are implemented, really can vary quite differently. So we have experience working with companies that are large energy utilities, academic and research institutions, transportation and logistics providers, and things like that. And so how we work with them in terms of they're all thinking about risk and risk assessment and doing risk identification as part of their business preparedness and business resilience efforts. But the specific tools and techniques and methodologies that we bring, really, really vary across those different sectors. And I think that's not unique to Cadmus. I think that's true for all different kinds of firms. So. I mean, I think your point, James, around is there opportunity for more tailoring, whether it be for different types of sectors or for different sizes of companies and things like that. I think those are all interesting considerations, and whether that is kind of done through the kind of teased out through the enforcement guidance and things like that, or revisions to the law itself. I think those will probably all be things that are under consideration once the law is kind of implemented for a while, and start to see some lessons learned, and kind of how the impacts that it's having in reality.
But as I think through possibly tailoring, according to different size companies or different industries, it's a very difficult one, right? Because the value of a human life is the same whether this person works for a small company or a huge company. So I think that we need to be very careful in how we assess that as well. But just in closing, I wanted the couple of us to talk about kind of what we're doing at Amcham and how the SAPA can be a value add or a liability for foreign CEOs here. At Amcham, one of our number one priorities, especially in 2022, is to help make Korea a regional headquarters in Asia, which means we're going to have a lot of foreign CEOs here. We're going to have Korean CEOs running, global companies here in Asia. But we still hear a lot about, wow, by moving to Korea to run Asia, I'm subject to SAPA. So just in closing, both to Sean and to David, what do you tell the CEO about taking the job here as the CEO of Asia under SAPA? David?
So just to reiterate, do you want me to sort of give my personal opinion on regarding foreign CEOs coming to work in Korea?
Yes. And what, what areas should we recommend the Korean government to consider, modify, or tweak so that we can attract more CEOs here in South Korea to run Asia?
Yeah. Okay, so just to put it in a nutshell, like the SAPA has two key objectives. So the one is to improve industrial safety in Korea, and the other is to impose criminal punishment on responsible executives and companies that fail to perform the obligation to improve workplace health and safety. Now, my take is if too much emphasis is placed on the criminal punishment of responsible executives, companies may be more inclined to focus on perfunctory safety management to relieve these responsible executives from criminal liability, rather than making efforts to actually enhance health and safety. So my take is that the government needs to give more positive assessment and provide systematic support to these companies' efforts to improve health and safety. And the main requests of companies in general have been, okay, look, we understand that the legislation is in place and we are willing to abide by it, but it has to be practical. And the government should actually assist businesses in being able to be in a place to implement health and safety systems which are compliant with the new law. So I think the general consensus of businesses at the moment is, can you help us? Can you lend out? Can you give us more practical guidance? I know there's a legislation, we're spending money, we're willing to comply with it, but it's still quite murky. And this is applicable to foreign CEOs as well. So I think at the moment, the horizon might be bright. I'm pretty sure the new administration may, present some new criteria and some clarification regarding the legislation, penalties, and the general act and enforcement degree, which may open up a bit of more breathing space for domestic companies and foreign CEOs to come through. Because I know that there's been talk that a lot of foreign companies are refraining from sending CEOs at the stage because of the new act. But I mean, in a nutshell, I guess the government, like I mentioned before, is likely to provide continued guidance and more clarification, and therefore I think foreign companies and CEOs should have more breathing space in Korea. Yeah.
What about you, Sean?
Sure. I mean, I think a couple things jump to mind. One is, I think that I certainly understand the concern and the risks that might be perceived for executives given the enforcement of SAPA and things like that. I guess again, I would take a step back and think about these are fundamentally kind of important actions that companies need to be thinking about in terms of workplace safety and health, and also then kind of broader business preparedness and business resilience. So there's an opportunity for these firms to kind of put that front and center and to show that they're treating kind of taking it seriously, and there are lots of tools and resources that are out there that I think can help companies be better prepared, be more resilient, address some of their specific concerns that they have around occupational and worker safety and health and things like that. So I think that's kind of a key perspective that that I would have. So yeah.
Great. Well, I think we have come to the end of our webinar. So just in closing, I want to thank Sean and David for being a great panelist. I actually learned a lot from both of you as well. I think this is going to be an evolving legislation, and I hope that through these kind of dialogues we could tweak some things and help make it a lot better. And the audience should also know that at Amcham we had 2 SAPA-related webinars. So it's all available via the Amcham Korea YouTube channel. So you can get a lot more information about SAPA. And lastly, I want to thank Ken Choi from the Chosun Ilbo for hosting this very important webinar, I believe, and to congratulate the Asian Leadership Conference for the great job they always do every year. So again, thank you, everybody. Hope to see you guys, live one day. So have a great day. And thank you very much, audience, for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.